By the third week of January 1889, the pass above Silverthread Gulch had been sealed by avalanche for 11 straight days. Wind tore across the shaft heads at more than 40 miles an hour. The temperature at the assay office thermometer had fallen to 22 below zero. The Templeton Vassar Silver Consolidated Mining Company had already closed its books and abandoned the camp to whatever fate the mountain decided. Inside the cookhouse at the foot of Bitter Ridge, Sarah Halloran lit the sixth lantern of the morning and stood alone above the trapdoor beneath the flour bin. 60 miners, 3 widows, 7 children, and 2 injured shift bosses waited outside the door for breakfast. 4 months earlier, she had arrived at the camp with a single trunk and no past she was willing to name. Now the survival of every soul on the mountain rested on stores that no one had ever seen her buy. How had a woman with no forwarding letter and no wagon crew come to hold the last honest kitchen in Silverthread Gulch? To answer that, we must return to a warm September evening months before, when a mail wagon rolled to a stop at the final switchback below the camp, and a stranger stepped down. Late in September of 1888, Sarah Halloran arrived at Silverthread Gulch with one leather trunk and a folded apron pinned inside her coat. She was 34, though the road had already put fine lines at the corners of her mouth. Her dress had been mended at the collar with careful thread that did not quite match the fabric. She carried no letter of introduction, no name from a mine foreman, and no promise of a bed for the night. The male driver set her trunk on the boards, tipped his hat once, and turned the mules back down the mountain before she could thank him. Silverthread Gulch had once been a serious silver camp. 2 years earlier, more than 200 men had worked its 2 main shafts. Now the tally was closer to 60. The Templeton Vassar Company had cut wages twice in a single season. The vein at the number 3 shaft had thinned to almost nothing. Half the miners spoke openly about walking down the mountain before the first snow. The camp cookhouse had gone through 3 cooks in 8 months. The last one had left in August, and since then, meals had been reduced to boiled beans, salt pork gone rancid at the edges, and coffee that tasted like burned tin. Men worked hungry. Men worked angry, and the company store no longer extended credit to anyone who could not swing a pick full shift. Kenneth Marsh, the widowed shift boss of the number 2 shaft, stood beside the ore scales when he first noticed the stranger. He was 38, tall in a way that no longer straightened when he walked, and had 2 boys waiting for him at the end of every shift. Emmett was 10. Jonah was 7. Their mother, Ruth, had died the previous winter of pneumonia that she had refused to name in front of the children. Since then, Kenneth had been feeding the boys on whatever the cookhouse spared and whatever he could barter at the company store. Neither was enough. Emmett had grown quiet in the way boys grow quiet when they stop expecting answers. Jonah had stopped growing at all. Sarah did not ask for directions. She watched the smoke from the cookhouse chimney for a long moment, read the wind against her cheek, and walked toward it without hurry. Kenneth watched her go. Something about the way she carried her trunk told him she had done hard work before. Something about the way she did not look back told him she did not intend to explain what kind. He would not think of her again until the following morning, when she appeared at his own door with a proposal no man in the camp had ever heard before. The knock came just after sunrise. Kenneth opened the door of his 2-room miner's cabin in his shirt sleeves, a tin cup still warm in his hand. Sarah stood on the plank step with her trunk beside her and her coat buttoned to the throat. Behind her, the first thin frost of the season lay across the tailings pile like a dusting of powdered lime. Emmett appeared at his father's elbow. Joan appeared from behind the stove. Both boys stared at the stranger without speaking. Sarah did not step forward. She did not offer a hand. She spoke as though she had rehearsed each word on the walk up the ridge, which she had. "Mr. Marsh, my name is Sarah Halloran. I have come to make you an offer, and I would ask you to hear it before you decide." Kenneth said nothing. He had learned in the mines that silence often drew more truth from a person than questions ever did. "I understand your wife has been gone almost a year. I understand your boys eat what the cookhouse leaves and what the store will trade. I understand you are a shift boss, and a shift boss cannot leave the shaft to cook a meal and cannot afford to hire a woman to cook one for him. Kenneth's jaw tightened, but he still did not speak. Sarah went on. I am asking you to marry me, not in the way the word usually means. I am asking for your name on paper, your roof over my head, and the right to use your stove and your storeroom and to feed your sons at your table. In return, I will keep your house, I will feed your boys 3 meals a day, and I will ask nothing of you that a wife would ordinarily ask. You will keep your bed. I will keep the cookhouse room off the pantry that has been standing empty since your last boarder left. We will share a name and a door. Nothing else. Kenneth set his cup on the shelf beside the door. He looked at her for a long moment. Why? The single word carried no anger, only the honest weight of a man who had learned to ask short questions. Sarah did not look away. Because I need a place where no one will ask me for a forwarding letter, because I have skills that will feed more than 2 boys if a stove is given to me, and because a woman alone in this camp will not last the winter, and I intend to last the winter. Emmett spoke before his father could answer. His voice was small and careful. Can you make bread? Sarah turned to him with a softness she had not shown Kenneth. I can make bread. I can make bread from flour that has been in a barrel too long, and from flour that is fresh, and from flour that has been mixed with cornmeal because the fresh has run out. I can make it with yeast, with sourdough, with soda, and with only heat and time. Jonah stepped out from behind the stove. He was thin in the way children are thin when they have been thin too long. He did not ask a question. He simply looked at Sarah as though he was measuring whether to believe her. Kenneth crossed his arms. On the shelf beside him sat a tin plate with the last 2 biscuits from the cookhouse, gone gray at the edges, that had been the boys' supper the night before and would be their breakfast if nothing else appeared. He thought of Ruth. He thought of the shaft. He thought of the winter that had not yet begun. The camp will talk, he said quietly. They will say things about you. They will say things about me. Sarah nodded once, as though she had already counted this cost, and set it aside. Let them talk, Mr. Marsh. Talk does not feed children. They were married 3 days later by Reverend Alden Prescott, the circuit preacher who came up the mountain twice a month whether he was wanted or not. The ceremony took place in the front room of Kenneth's cabin at 10 o'clock in the morning, with Emmett standing beside his father and Jonah holding the corner of Sarah's sleeve as though he had already decided she belonged to him. The preacher read the short form. Kenneth signed his name in a careful, blocky hand. Sarah signed hers with a fluid loop that spoke of a schoolroom somewhere far from a mining camp, though no one at the table remarked on it. There was no ring. Sarah had said she did not want one, and Kenneth, who had buried Ruth's ring with her because he could not bear to see it on another woman's hand, did not argue. The preacher accepted a jar of stewed apples in place of the usual fee, wrote the marriage into his ledger, and rode back down the mountain before noon. By supper time, the whole camp knew. The talk began at the cookhouse. It moved to the assay office. It reached the number 3 shaft before the day shift came up. Some of the miners laughed openly. Others said nothing, but looked at Kenneth with a mixture of pity and confusion when he walked past the ore scales the next morning. A man named Bram Caldwell, who worked the Powder magazine and had never learned to keep an opinion behind his teeth, said aloud in the mess line that Marsh had gone soft in the head since Ruth died, and had let a stranger walk into his house without so much as a letter from a former employer. Kenneth heard the remark. He set down his plate, turned to Caldwell, and said only, "My boys ate hot bread this morning. When was the last time yours did?" Caldwell had no answer. Kenneth picked up his plate and walked out. That afternoon, Sarah opened Kenneth's storeroom and took a full inventory. She wrote everything in a small cloth-bound book she carried in her apron pocket. 2 sacks of flour, both older than they should have been. A half-barrel of cornmeal with weevils at the top and clean grain beneath. Salt pork of poor grade. A crock of drippings gone slightly rancid. Beans, dried peas, a small store of rice that Ruth must have set aside before her illness. A tin of coffee, mostly chicory. Sugar in a jar so small it might have lasted a week if she had been careless, and would last a month because she would not be. She counted the eggs from Kenneth's 2 hens, examined the small root cellar dug into the hill behind the cabin, and made a note of every jar of preserves Ruth had left on the shelves. When she was finished, she closed the book and put it back in her pocket. That evening she cooked her first supper. It was not elaborate. She had softened the old flour with a little of the cornmeal, added drippings she had rendered clean over low heat, and baked a pan of hot biscuits that split open in soft, steaming halves. She had rinsed the salt pork 3 times, simmered it with dried peas and a piece of onion she had found buried in the root cellar, and set out a small dish of the stewed apples the preacher had not taken. Jonah ate 2 biscuits before he remembered to breathe. Emmett ate his slowly, the way a boy eats when he does not want a meal to end. Kenneth ate his without speaking. When he was finished, he set down his fork and looked across the table at Sarah. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Sarah met his eyes evenly. "In a kitchen," she said. "That is all I will say tonight." Kenneth nodded once. He asked nothing further. Within a week, the camp began to notice something it could not quite name. The Marsh boys walked to the schoolhouse with color in their cheeks. Emmett had stopped hoarding bread in his pockets. Jonah had begun to grow again in the way that hungry children grow when they finally stop being hungry, which is to say all at once. Kenneth came off his shift and did not have to wonder what his sons had eaten. The change was small in the accounting of a mining camp, where men measured their days by ore weight and shift hours, but it was visible to anyone who looked. By the second week, Sarah walked down to the cookhouse. The main cook was a man named Wilbur Teague, 60 years old, half-blind in one eye, and hired the previous month because no one else would take the wages the company was offering. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had never learned to cook and had been asked to feed 60 miners 3 times a day on whatever the company store would release. When Sarah stepped through the door with her small cloth-bound book in one hand and a folded apron over her arm, Teague looked up from a pot of beans that had scorched at the bottom and said only, "You come to laugh at me too, Mrs." Sarah did not laugh. She walked to the stove, lifted the lid, looked at the beans, and set the lid back down. "I have come to offer you help, Mr. Teague, not to take your place. Your name stays on the wages. Mine does not appear anywhere. I will work in this kitchen from 4 in the morning until 7 at night, and in return I will use what is in your storeroom in the ways I know how. If the men eat better, you will be the cook who fed them. If they do not, I will walk back up the hill and never come again." Teague stared at her for a long moment. He had been braced for insult. He had not been braced for a proposal that would let him keep his wages and his dignity together. "Why would you do that?" Sarah looked around the cookhouse. The floor had not been scrubbed in months. The flour barrel stood too close to the stove. The salt pork hung from a hook above a drip pan that had not been emptied in a week. "Because a camp with a bad kitchen is a camp that empties out before spring," she said quietly. "And I have my reasons for wanting this camp to still be here in spring." Teague did not ask what those reasons were. He nodded once and handed her the wooden spoon. By the end of the 3rd week, the cookhouse had changed in ways that the miners noticed before the ledger did. The floor had been scrubbed with lye water. The flour barrel had been moved to the cool side of the room. The salt pork hung above a clean pan of water that Sarah changed twice a day. The scorched pot was gone, replaced by 2 smaller pots that let the beans simmer instead of burn. The bread came out of the oven in whole loaves instead of the flat, gray discs the men had grown used to. And the coffee, which Sarah had cut with a small measure of roasted barley she had found in a forgotten sack, tasted like something a man might want to drink twice. The miners came in suspicious. They left full. By the 4th week, the mess line stretched all the way to the door, and men who had already eaten were coming back to sit near the stove just to feel warm. Bram Caldwell came through the line one evening, took his plate without meeting Sarah's eyes, and ate every bite in silence. When he brought his empty tin back to the pass-through, he set it down carefully and muttered a single word. "Thank you." The first snow fell on the 8th of October, 3 weeks earlier than the oldest men in the camp could remember. It came down in dry, hard flakes that stung the face and settled into the seams of every roof. By the end of the day, 4 inches lay across the tailings piles, and the wind had begun to pull long white streamers off the ridge above the number 2 shaft. Kenneth came home to find Sarah standing in the doorway of the cookhouse with her arms folded, looking at the sky with the still, measuring gaze of a woman who had already begun counting days. That evening, after the boys were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table across from Kenneth and opened her cloth-bound book to a page she had not shown him before. On it, in the same fluid hand that had signed the marriage register, she had written a list. Flour in pounds, cornmeal in pounds, beans in pounds, rice, salt, sugar, coffee, lard, dried apples, dried peaches, molasses. Beside each item, 2 columns, what the company store held, what she believed the camp would need to reach the 15th of April. The second column was larger than the first in every line. Kenneth studied the page for a long moment. He was not a man who read numbers quickly, but he was a shift boss, and a shift boss learned to read a ledger by the shape of its columns before he read the figures themselves. How long have you been keeping this? Since the second day. And you have not told the company. The company closed its credit book in August, Mr. Marsh. The company will close its shafts by February if the vein does not thicken. I do not tell the company anything, because the company is not going to be here when the food runs out. Kenneth sat back in his chair. The stove ticked softly as the iron cooled. Outside, the wind had risen a note higher. What are you asking me to do? Sarah closed the book. I am asking you to say nothing. I am asking you to trust that I know what I am doing when I trade a pan of biscuits to Allestad the freighter for a sack of flour he was going to sell down in Georgetown. I am asking you not to question when I take the small jar of coin I brought in my trunk and send it down the mountain with the mail wagon for goods I will not name until they arrive. And I am asking you to let me keep whatever comes back in a place that only you and I will know about. Kenneth looked at her for a long time. You brought money up here. I brought what I had. It is not a fortune. It is enough to buy a winter for 60 people if it is spent carefully, and if no one knows it has been spent. Why keep it secret? Sarah's hands rested flat on the table. Because a camp that knows one person has stores will strip those stores in a week. Because a company that knows one person has stores will find a reason to seize them. And because I have learned, Mr. Marsh, that the safest place for a thing worth keeping is a place no one thinks to look. Kenneth was silent for a long while. Then he stood, crossed to the stove, and banked the fire for the night the way he always did before bed. When he turned back, he spoke without looking at her. The root cellar behind the cabin has a false wall at the back. Ruth's father built it during the Panic of '73, when he did not trust the banks and did not trust the neighbors either. I have never used it. You may. Sarah did not thank him. She simply nodded once, closed her book, and put it back in her apron pocket. The next morning she began. Through October and into November, Sarah moved with the patience of a woman building something no one was meant to see. She traded a pan of hot rolls to Allestad the freighter for a canvas sack of good flour that had been meant for a hotel in Georgetown. She traded a jar of stewed peaches to a shift boss's wife for 4 pounds of dried beans the woman's husband had bought from a passing peddler and forgotten in a trunk. She sent $7 down the mountain with the mail wagon and received back a small crate marked as household goods that contained 20 pounds of rice, 10 of sugar, and a tin of good coffee wrapped in oiled paper. She traded biscuits for salt. She traded bread for lard. She traded a single pie, made from the last of Ruth's preserved cherries, and set on the sill of the cookhouse to cool where every man in the camp could smell it, for a promise from the assay clerk to look the other way if she asked him to, sometime later in the winter, about the weight of a certain sack of oats. None of it looked like much on any single day. On any single day, it looked like a woman cooking. But at the end of each week, Sarah would walk up the hill after the cookhouse was dark, unlatch the door of the root cellar behind the cabin, slide back the false wall her husband's father-in-law had built during the Panic of '73, and add what she had gathered to the shelves inside. By the middle of November, the false room behind the cellar held more food than the company's store's back pantry. By the 1st of December, it held nearly twice as much. Kenneth never went into the cellar. He had told her the door was hers, and he meant it. But he watched. in the way a shift boss watches the roof of a drift for the first hairline crack, and he understood that his wife in name was doing something he had never seen a person do before. She was building a winter under the mountain the way a man built a shaft, one careful timbering at a time, and she was doing it while the rest of the camp still believed the company would send a supply train through the pass in January. The company did not. On the 22nd of December, a letter came up the mountain in the mail sack. It was addressed to the shift bosses and read aloud that evening in the assay office by the clerk, a thin, nervous man named Pruitt Hollins who had been left in charge because the mine superintendent had gone down to Denver for what he had called consultation. The letter was signed by a vice president of the Templeton Vassar Consolidated. It regretted to inform the men of Silverthread Gulch that the company would not be sending a January supply train. It regretted to inform them that wages for December would be paid in scrip redeemable at the company store, and that the company store's stocks would not be replenished until further notice. It regretted a great many things. It offered no remedy for any of them. The room was silent when Hollins finished reading. Bram Caldwell was the first to speak. "They are cutting us loose. They are cutting us loose for the winter," Kenneth said quietly. "They will come back in April if the vein is worth it, and they will not come back if it is not. Either way, we are on our own until the pass opens." A miner named Doyle Fenwick asked the question everyone had been avoiding. "How long can the store feed 60 men?" Hollins looked at his ledger. He did not look up when he answered. 6 weeks. Maybe 7 if we cut the ration. Kenneth thought of the false wall behind his root cellar. He said nothing. Sarah, at the cookhouse, was already kneading tomorrow's bread. The avalanche came down the pass on the 9th of January at 3:15 in the afternoon. The sound reached the camp 4 seconds before the shockwave, a long, low rumble that the older miners recognized before the younger ones understood what they were hearing. By the time the second boom rolled off the ridge above the number 3 shaft, every man in Silverthread Gulch was standing outside his cabin door, looking up at the white plume rising against the winter sky where a mountainside had just moved. Doyle Fenwick and 2 of the younger hands rode the switchback up the following morning to see what could be seen. They came back at dusk with their horses steaming and their faces gray. 200 feet deep at the Narrows, Fenwick reported to the assay office. Trees standing straight up in it like grave markers. No wagon will cross that pass before April. No sled either. A man might snowshoe it in 3 days if he was willing to die trying. Pruitt Hollins closed his ledger and did not open it again for a week. The camp did what camps do when the world contracts around them. The men counted what was in the company store and divided it by mouths and by days. The number that came back was 31 days, at half rations, and only if no one fell sick and no one bore a child and no one ate more than his share. There were 70 people on the mountain, counting the widows and the school teacher and the children. There were 31 days of food. The pass would not open for at least 90. On the 12th of January, the shift bosses met in Kenneth's front room. Bram Caldwell was there. Doyle Fenwick was there. A drift boss named Ansel Woolery was there, and Hollins the assay clerk, and 2 of the older miners who had been through hard winters before. Sarah served coffee and did not sit down. They talked in the tight, clipped way of men who are counting deaths in their heads. They spoke of walking a party of the strongest down the mountain to bring help. They spoke of butchering the mules. They spoke of who would be told first when the store's ration was cut again and who would be told last. No one spoke of the children because the children were the mathematics that would not solve. When the meeting was almost done and the men were pulling their coats back on, Sarah set down the coffee pot and spoke. "Gentlemen, before you leave, there is something I would like to show you." They followed her out into the cold. She led them up the short path behind the cabin, unlatched the root cellar door and took down the lantern from the peg beside it. She lit the wick, stepped inside, and slid back the false wall her husband's father-in-law had built during the Panic of '73. The lantern light fell on shelves that reached from floor to ceiling. Sacks of flour stacked 3 deep, crates of rice and beans and dried peas, tins of coffee, a wooden box of sugar. jars of preserved fruit and vegetables lining the back wall 2 rows high, a small barrel of molasses, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the joists, salt in a canvas sack big enough to cure a hog, a shelf of yeast starters in stoneware crocks, each one labeled in Sarah's fluid hand with the date she had begun it. Bram Caldwell took off his hat without knowing he had done it. Doyle Fenwick made a small sound in his throat that was not quite a word. Ansel Woolery, who was not a man given to prayer, said very quietly, "Dear God." Kenneth stood in the doorway of the cellar and watched his wife. Sarah closed the false wall gently, as though the food behind it were sleeping. "There is enough here," she said, "to feed 60 people for 90 days, but only if I am the one who cooks it." They agreed before they left the cellar. There was no vote. Bram Caldwell, who had once mocked the marriage in the mess line, was the first to speak. "Mrs. Marsh, this camp is yours to feed. Tell us what you need and it will be done." Doyle Fenwick nodded. Ansel Woolery nodded. Hollins, who had spent a week not opening his ledger, opened it in his mind and closed it again on a different page. By the following morning, the cookhouse had become something new. Sarah moved the 2 long tables end to end so that the entire camp could eat in 2 sittings instead of 4. She hung a chalkboard beside the door and wrote on it the rules of the kitchen in a clear, plain hand. 1 plate per person per meal. No hoarding. No trading. Children eat first. The sick eat in their beds and someone will carry the plate. Anyone who works in the kitchen earns nothing extra but the satisfaction of the work. Anyone who steals from the storeroom will be asked to leave the camp on foot. No one stole. She organized the labor the way a shift boss organized a drift. 2 of the widows took the morning bread. 3 of the older boys carried water and split kindling. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Vesper Ainsworth, who had been on the point of walking down the mountain before the pass closed, took charge of the children's portions and made certain that Jonah Marsh and the 7 other small ones ate before anyone else lifted a fork. Wilbur Teague, whose name still stood on the company's wage book, kept the fires and the coffee, and never once complained that Sarah's hand had become the one that stirred the pot. The meals were not lavish. They were never meant to be, but they were hot, and they were sufficient, and they came at the same hour every day, which is a thing that matters more in a closed camp than people who have never lived in one can understand. Breakfast at 6, cornmeal mush with a spoonful of molasses and a piece of bread. Dinner at noon, bean soup with a scrap of pork and a biscuit. Supper at 5, whatever Sarah had decided the storeroom could spare, which was sometimes rice with dried apples, sometimes a thin stew of the last of the salt pork with onions from the root cellar, sometimes only bread and coffee and a small dish of preserves, but always something and always enough. The company store went empty on the 4th of February. No one panicked. By then, the camp had been eating from Sarah's kitchen for 3 weeks and had almost forgotten there had been another source of food at all. Pruitt Hollins came to the cookhouse that evening, sat down at the long table, and ate his supper in silence with the men whose wages he had once written in scrip. When he was finished, he carried his own plate to the pass-through and washed it in the basin like everyone else. There were hard days. A miner named Corley Whitman broke his leg on the 11th of February when a timber slipped in the number 2 shaft, where the men were still working out of habit as much as hope. Sarah sent broth to his cabin twice a day for 6 weeks and did not once complain that a broken-legged man ate as much as a working one. A child in the schoolteacher's care took a fever in the last week of February and would not eat solid food for 4 days. Sarah made her a custard from 3 of the last eggs and a spoonful of the sugar she had been rationing for coffee, and the child kept it down, and then she kept down bread, and then she was well. And through it all, no one on the mountain went to bed hungry. Kenneth watched his wife move through the cookhouse each night and understood, for the first time, that he had not married a stranger. He had married a general. The stranger came up the mountain on the 23rd of March, riding a rented mule behind a party of surveyors the company had sent to see whether the pass could be opened by hand. He was a small, neat man in a black wool coat, with silver at his temples and a leather case strapped behind his saddle. He gave his name at the assay office as Julius Ainsworth Redgrave, and he said he had come up on business of his own that had nothing to do with the mine. Pruitt Hollins, who had never heard the name and had no reason to challenge it, pointed him toward the cookhouse for a hot meal. Sarah was pulling a pan of bread from the oven when he stepped through the door. She set the pan on the rack, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned to greet the newcomer with the same steady welcome she gave every stranger. Then she saw his face, and the color left her own. Redgrave stopped 3 paces inside the door. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. When he did speak, his voice was very quiet. "Miss Halloran." "Mrs. Marsh," Sarah said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, folded now against her apron, had gone white at the knuckles. Redgrave inclined his head very slightly, accepting the correction without comment. He crossed to the long table, sat down at the end nearest the stove, and waited while Sarah served him a plate of bean soup, a biscuit, and a cup of coffee. He ate slowly. He did not look at her again until he had finished the soup and set his spoon down carefully across the rim of the bowl. "Might we speak," he said, "when your work permits?" Sarah served the rest of the supper and did not sit down until every miner had eaten and every plate had been washed. Then she poured 2 cups of coffee, sat down across from Redgrave at the long table, and folded her hands. "You have come a long way, Mr. Redgrave." "I have. I came up because I heard from a freighter named Alistad that a woman answering to a certain description was cooking in a mining camp above the pass. I did not entirely believe him, but I have been looking for you for 18 months, Miss Halloran, and I could not afford not to come." Sarah said nothing. Redgrave opened his leather case and took out a folded paper. He set it on the table between them. The Barclay Hotel filed suit against Mrs. Adelaide Vanderslice in November of the year before last. The suit was for conspiracy to introduce a poisoned course into a private dinner served to Mr. Cornelius Vanderslice's business rival, a Mr. Halstead of the Rocky Mountain Land Company. The suit was successful. Mrs. Vanderslice's testimony, given under oath in March of last year, named you as the head chef who refused to prepare the dish, refused to permit any member of your kitchen to prepare it, and was dismissed from her position for that refusal on the same evening. Her testimony has been corroborated by 3 members of your former staff and by the hotel's night manager. Your name has been cleared, Miss Halloran. It was cleared 11 months ago. The Barclay has been trying to find you ever since, so have I. Sarah looked at the folded paper for a long time before she picked it up. Her hands were steady now. She read it through once, then again. When she looked up, her eyes were dry. "Why you, Mr. Redgrave?" He smiled for the first time. "Because I was the maître d'hôtel of the Barclay for 11 years, Miss Halloran, and you were the finest chef I ever served under. When they cleared your name, I told the board that if they wanted you back, they would have to send someone who could look you in the eye. They sent me. The pass opened on the 17th of April. The first wagon through was Alistad's, loaded with flour and coffee and sugar the camp no longer desperately needed but was glad to see. The second was a company wagon bearing a letter from the Templeton Vassar vice president, expressing the board's profound gratitude for the endurance of the men of Silverthread Gulch and its regret that circumstances had prevented earlier relief. The letter was read aloud in the assay office, and then, by unspoken agreement, used to start the fire in the cookhouse stove the following morning. Julius Redgrave stayed a week. In that week he sat with Sarah at the long table each evening after supper and laid out what the Barclay Hotel was prepared to offer. Her old position restored, back wages for the 18 months she had been gone, a written apology from the board published in the Denver papers, a private suite on the hotel's 4th floor for as long as she wished to occupy it. He was authorized, he said, to raise any of these figures if she required raising. Sarah listened to all of it with the same steady attention she had once given to a pot of soup. When he was finished, she thanked him, and she said she would give him her answer before he rode back down the mountain. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Kenneth came home from the shaft and found her sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp burning low. He hung his coat on the peg, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down across from her. For a long moment neither of them spoke. "You could go back," he said at last. "I could. They cleared your name, the suite, the wages, all of it. All of it." Kenneth looked at his hands on the table. "I have been thinking these last weeks that the paper we signed in October was a bargain made in a bad season, and that a woman who has done what you have done for this camp deserves to be asked properly whether she would consent to make it something more than a paper. If you would stay, Sarah, if you would stay and be my wife in more than name, I would ask you now." Sarah looked at him for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was very gentle. "Kenneth, you are a good man. Your boys are good boys. I have loved feeding them. I have loved this table, but I did not come up this mountain to become a wife. I came up this mountain because I needed a place where no one would ask me for a letter, and you gave me one. What I owe you, I cannot pay by pretending to be something I am not. And what you deserve from a woman who married you for the reasons a woman ought to." Kenneth was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders that had been held tight for a long time let go. "Then what will you do?" Sarah smiled. "I will buy the cookhouse from the company. Mr. Redgrave has offered to advance the sum against my back wages, and the company will sell it because the company no longer wants it. I will run it as my own. I will feed this camp, and the camp that will grow around it when the vein thickens again, which it will. And I will need a shift boss who knows how to keep a storeroom and who is not afraid of hard winters. I would like to hire you, Kenneth Marsh, if you will have the work." Kenneth laughed once quietly in the way a man laughs when he has been offered something better than what he asked for. "I will have the work." The camp survived. Within 3 years, Silverthread Gulch was a town, and the town was built around Sarah Halloran's kitchen. The paper marriage was quietly dissolved. Kenneth kept the storeroom. Emmett grew tall. Jonah grew taller. And Sarah, who had come up the mountain with one trunk and no past, was known for the rest of her long life as the woman who had never mistaken loneliness for a reason to stop cooking.